So it seems that we've got a new and scary Imperial Guard detachment dropping in style. Let's talk about some massive damage punches from the sky and turn some special weapons up to max power. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Imperial Guard once more, and in this video we're going to take a look over the Bridgehead strike, the new detachment content for the Guard for Grotmus. As ever for December, we've got new 40k rules coming out literally every day, a new detachment for each and every faction in the game, all fully playable in the core match play rules, points for enhancements available right away, though becoming available on the Warhammer app in January. It seems that day 15 is for the Astra Militarum. Yesterday we had a really fun Orc detachment with some cunning Blood Axe tactics that I'll hopefully be covering as the next video here on the channel, and they're certainly not slacking off the pace at all, as tomorrow we've got the really big rules drop that's coming for the Chaos Demons, where we're getting detachments for each of the Chaos Deities. I was certainly interested to see what the Guard will get though. It's an interesting time for the Astra Militarum at the moment. They were basically one of the strongest factions in the game until very recently, though unfortunately ate some rather big nerfs in the balanced data slate, though all of those might be kind of short-lived given that we've got their codex coming out in the not too distant future. That'll hopefully be along in January with a bunch of new Krieg. For their rules content today though, we got the Bridgehead strike. This one does indeed appear to be a scion-focused detachment, representing a force of Guard elite infantry deploying at speed to seize a critical location, perhaps a mountain pass or bridge or key choke point, using armoured vehicles or Valkyries to get them there, and generally deploying at speed, grabbing the location, and then holding out against all the odds against whatever the enemy can throw at them until reinforcements can catch up. In terms of the actual rules, it does seem to be really quite focused on the Militarum Tempestus Units. I think compared with Born Soldiers and Combined Regiment, it's probably not going to have quite enough here, if you're not running at least a fairly good proportion of those. I certainly called this one absolutely immediately when they revealed the Guard detachments. It just seemed really conspicuous that they didn't have a Scion 1 in the codex, and given that they announced that Grotmus detachments were happening in the same reveal show as the Guard codex was unveiled, it kind of just made a lot of logical sense that the Militarum Tempestus will get their army here. I feel like this is a pretty weird one not to have in the codex though. The Militarum Tempestus are at least a fairly major sub-faction within the Guard. They don't really have all that many model kits, but they do have some, and they briefly had their own codex once upon a time, and it just seems a very weird design choice to deliberately leave them out of the codex. I feel it's kind of deliberate that they could have put them in there and done something else with Grotmus, but they decided just to spread the same content out between the core book and this digital drop. Just seems kind of odd given that it's not like there were excessive detachments in the codex, there's only 5 of them. I feel like this one should have been there and they should have done something weirder for the Grotmus one, but at least we're getting it in some form one way or another. The challenge for the detachment is that it's going to be revolving around just a few datasheets, so it does need to give them some pretty interesting stuff to make them work and carry the army. Though at initial impressions I feel like this one could be pretty fun. It definitely doesn't feel like just one to flat out dismiss. Getting into the core rules, there's basically 2 parts to them. The ability to basically count the Scion squads as troops pretty much here, and then a core rule for damage buffs both for infantry and Tempestus specifically. First up, there's a rule here that says that if a Militarum Tempestus officer model is your army's warlord, Tempestus Scion units in the army gain battle line, and if the unit isn't battle shocked, you get to add +1 to the objective control characteristic of the Scion squad. So they're basically OC2 at base, and potentially they can gain much more from a banner to make them OC3, and even an order to make them OC4, though I feel like that's probably not going to be needed, and you're more likely to be going for damage dealer type things. This one feels like it's probably going to be the new version of the index rule that you get. That one only gives you the battle line thing, but not the objective control thing. I'd guess that more general rule will probably go away in the codex, and it won't be a thing outside of this detachment. The battle line thing definitely seems good in this detachment. Tempestus Scions really do seem to be the unit that's maximally supported here, and I feel like it's pretty conceivable that you could want more than 3 of them. And the OC2 thing is quite nice if you are going to have a whole bunch. They certainly don't have all that much survivability on objectives, being only T3 and a 4+ save for 12 points or so, but it certainly helps out for a bit of extra pressure when they do need to pile on and grab points. It does mean that this bit of the rule won't function if you're using Lord Solar though, who has to be the warlord, so that would be a trade-off there, and I feel like in this detachment that's a genuine motivation not to take him along. I still feel like it's probably not unviable here though. Even at 150 points and with his rules change, he could still maybe have 3 big drops of Scions and then maybe some Aquilons or something, and have him supporting a tank line as basically 2 parts to the force. Otherwise though, for the actual core rule that deals damage, we've got Only the Best and Fire Zone Purge, and these will be in place of the Born Soldiers rule that you currently get from the Combined Regiment. which is currently really quite a powerful lethal hits for regiment things against anything that isn't a tank or vehicle, and lethal hits for squadron vehicles against anything that is. It is a very good rule to support guard shooting, and this definitely is a trade-off for vehicles. First up, the Only the Best rule gives infantry reroll hit rolls of 1 at range. That's a handy enough small boost, normally a flat plus 17% damage increase on average, and this one looks like the bit of the rule that is targeted to things that aren't Tempestus Scions as they already have it. Maybe trying to make the detachment a little bit more relevant to other guard infantry, and then just have the added bonus for them. I guess it's not impossible that their datasheet rule could change though, I suppose. It's definitely not awful for the other units that you might include like that though, even if I think for low strength things like lasguns, it's probably going to be a bit weaker than lethal hits for most things, though I guess it's quite nice for units like Ogrins with their ripper guns and Ratlings with their snipers, who don't usually get born soldiers anyway. The bigger part of the rule though is the Fire Zone Purge one, which is a Militarum Tempestus focused one. Each time a Tempestus unit makes a ranged attack on a turn in which it was set up on the battlefield, either from reserves or disembarking from a transport, he gets to add +1 to the wound roll. That was a very nice shooting buff for special weapons and hotshot lasguns. Both of those might be wounding on 5s or 6s versus certain targets, so any improvement to that is great. In a complete vacuum, it's kind of similar to lethal hits if you already had it, so it won't be the absolute biggest buff in the world against things like infantry or bikes, but it will make a massive ton of difference if you're shooting at vehicles or monsters, where special weapons go from being at least kind of tame to utterly murderous. You'd have plasma weapons and melter weapons wounding on a 4+ here. It also stacks a little bit better with sustained hits from Scion command squads, and could be seriously nasty if a unit's jumping out of a Taurox Prime, as that one allows you to reroll all the wound rolls. You could be wounding tanks and monsters on a 4+ rerolling the wounds, so wounding them 3/4 of the time. Currently in the Codex, the vehicles themselves can't benefit from it. They don't currently have the Militarum Tempestus keyword, though it's possible that they might gain that in the Codex, I guess. Overall though, definitely feels like a solid detachment rule. Tempestus Scions with command squads dropping into the board and dealing damage are already scary, and it does look like this one's broadly better here than it is compared with the Codex, just because they're so much better against tanks and vehicles as well as infantry. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Deploymats, an Australian based company who make mats for playing Warhammer 40k on, who mainly sell their things on Etsy. I'm sure plenty of people will be well familiar with the type of mats that these are. They're basically sort of like neoprene, almost like mouse mat sort of material. You store them rolled up and then it makes a nice surface to play on, to have something a little bit better looking compared with just plain tabletop. Their biggest and best design is this double-sided one, 60 by 44 inches, aimed at 10th edition, and on the two different sides you've got an overgrown factory one and a chaos landscape. And the clever thing about these ones is they've got subtle lines on them that tally with the Pariah Nexus deployment zones built into the picture design on the mat itself, and then some trinkets and spots where objective markers should be, just so that you get a super quick setup for a game. And once you've worked out which lines you're using, you wouldn't need to mark out with dice or anything like that. They're cheapest in Australia due to international shipping, $200 Australian, though can do international delivery for £160 or $170 US. There's a slightly cheaper one-sided version as well, with either the Chaos Landscape or the Overgrown one, if you just like the one design. In any case, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. I'll link their Etsy store where they broadly have good reviews and good ratings, and in any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Getting back to the Militarum Tempestus though, and before we jump into the Stratagems, I thought we could go through their units first, and roughly what they do. In this detachment, the base troops are going to be the Tempestus Scions pretty much. They're now 60 points rather than 50 per 5 of them, so they did go up quite a bit in the balance update. And usually for these ones you get a power fist on the sergeant, a melter and a plasma, or maybe swap one of those out for a hotshot volley gun in the squad. And their special rule is to be able to reroll hit rolls of 1, or all hit rolls against something or an objective. They can be useful either as cheap squads to drop for secondary objectives, though can absolutely be doing well as a primary damage dealer alongside their command squad. Speaking of which, they're 70 points, you get 5 here, so you could have a 15 strong squad with 5 of these guys plus a backstat Tempestus squad. They give you an order which can trigger when they drop, so it could either be hitting on 2s or getting extra shots with rapid fire weapons. They add in sustained hits to their units, so yet more damage there, and you're likely to get a few more of those with the 4 rerolls that they can get. And then you've either got the option of absolutely going maximal on special weapons or taking their various extras, the medic giving a feel no pain, the banner extra OC, the Master Vox long range orders, and the officer can either take a plasma pistol or a command rod for the potential to double down on orders if it should make sense to. They do only get 1 order themselves though. When put together, you get a squad that can take a massive chunk out of any elite infantry with all the special weapons, and can still do some good damage against vehicles. Then we've got the Aquilons, who now have their 6-inch drop rather than 3-inch, and went up to 110 points. They are basically paying a big premium for the drop close rule. Their damage output isn't quite as good, and generally just effective against lighter infantry now. I feel like they could still be tempting enough just to have a unit that's going to have a good chance to grab secondaries and clear out enemy backfield units, but they're definitely way worse than they used to be. Finally, for transports, we've got the Taurox Prime, which can allow you to reroll wound rolls after you jump out of it, which is a pretty nasty buff to a Tempestus Scion squad. It does have a bit of firepower itself, though as mentioned it doesn't actually have the Tempestus keyword itself, so won't be able to use the detachment rule even if it's in reserve. The Valkyrie at the moment could be another alternative if you want to play lore appropriate, though unfortunately for 190 points it's just kind of hilariously overcosted and just doesn't compete with the ground transports very well. In any case, with those units and combos in mind, let's get into the stratagems, and first up we have one called Bellicosa Drop, which gives you a 6-inch deep strike for Astra Militarum units that already have it. I guess this would have been a 3-inch deep strike one before the last balance update, but got changed. I feel like I do quite like this one. It's certainly handy positioning for a Scion strike. It's going to make it very hard for the enemy to screen them, and they're going to be able to drop on more targets than they otherwise would be able to. But it is a bit less good than a 3-inch drop would have been, particularly as you can't get within melter range with it, and you won't have as many options. It does feel like slightly unfortunate overlap with the Tempestus Aquilons, where that's really their one selling point. If you can do this with the regular Scions that can deal far better damage with their rerolls and extra special weapons, it just feels like the Aquilons are going to be kind of niche in a Scion detachment. Next up, for one command point, we've got Firing Hot. A Militarum Tempestus or Kazakin unit gets +1 strength and +1 AP to various hotshot weapons, though it looks like they forgot to list the long las that the Aquilons get for some reason. That feels like it's probably just an oversight. That definitely makes their small arms a lot more punchy. It'd be strength 4 AP -2 las guns, and the volley gun going to strength 5 AP too. It definitely seems handy enough if you want to put a whole load of damage, particularly if you're getting both an extra +1 to wound with that, and also the enemy's got a good armor save, say if you're shooting against some Space Marines perhaps. I think I'd probably only want to use this if you had a volley gun or two in the unit though, as otherwise I feel like you might just be affecting less las guns than you'd really like, as you'd still be wanting to swap out any ones that could for special weapons. Certainly seems okay though, even the small arms will be taking chunks out of things with +1 to wound, and you could stack it with other damage buffs like extra AP from an Exterminator Russ, getting AP3 hot shots really quite easily there. Next up we've got Fire and Relocate, which is a nice simple advance and shoot. You can't use it on Titanic units, but you can use it on anything else. So this one isn't locked to Tempestus Scions or even infantry. You can use it on things like tanks as well. This one's just a flat good stratagem for the entire army in general. Guard tend to be at least a slowish moving shooting army outside of move. I guess in lines of sight can be a really big deal. Being able to advance and shoot is situational, but if it either gets you a line of sight, gets in range with something like multi-melters, or allows you to get to an objective that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to, and still allows your unit to shoot, all of those could easily be worth one command point. I'm sure there will be times when it gets used on infantry given this detachment, maybe Scions or even Kazakin moving from behind cover perhaps, but it seems like it could be really helpful for tanks. You could have Demolisher Russes or Rogol Dawns zooming along to draw lines of sight behind terrain that otherwise they wouldn't have been able to do, or getting a bunch of multi-melters in range. This one's just a really good stratagem for the guard, and to get used a lot if it was in the combined regiment. Next for one command point is On My Position, which is a new take on the one guy with the Voxcaster calling down artillery bombardment on a position that's getting overrun, likely making a glorious sacrifice in friendly fire to make sure that an enemy advance is destroyed. In this version of it, you have it with a regimental infantry unit that is used at the end of your opponent's fight phase only, so it can't be at the end of yours, and at the end of that fight phase you have to be within engagement range of one or more enemy units. If they are, then for each enemy unit you roll a dice, and on a 2+ they take d6 mortal wounds, so that could be really quite a nasty damage punch, but in return your own unit suffers 3d3 mortal wounds, so minimum of 3, maximum of 9. Basically it just means with average rolling on both of those, you're likely to take far more damage yourself, and your opponent isn't really reliably going to take anything much. I feel like this one's really cool and thematic. I feel like it's going to be strong enough that situationally it will absolutely get used, though it's not really going to be one that you can just do really reliably, as it kind of requires your opponent to set it up, likely charging one of your units who just managed to hold out, perhaps with one guy left or something. And then as an alternative to keeping them alive and falling them back, you could just trade it out for a bit of mortal wound damage if you wanted to, except that your 1 or 2 guys left are going to die. But hopefully this will do enough damage to finish off the enemy squad or take a big chunk out of them. I think that sometimes those trade-offs there are going to be at least kind of big though. Having individual scions and things running around can often be helpful for secondary objectives and things, and you wouldn't usually want to be taking 6 casualties unless they're really quite cheap infantry. And most of the time I think you're unlikely to be able to get 2 enemy units within range for this. As mentioned, it does kind of depend on your opponent setting them up and keeping them in combat at the end of their fight phase. If you could trigger it on some chaff though, or a unit that you've got one model left that you didn't really care about too much, it could be quite nice on anything that's super valuable though, things with high saves or -1 damage, like Redemptor Dreadnoughts perhaps. In any case, I think even if it's used kind of infrequently, it's certainly really good fun. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got an Ignored Cover 1 for Servo Designators. An infantry unit uses this after it's shot. One of the units hit by at least some of its attacks can no longer claim the benefit of cover until the end of the phase, so they're basically lighting up a target that the rest of your army can go to town on. You do have to have line of sight to your target, so you can't use a mortar to ping this out for you. I think to have this for 1 command point it's really quite a useful one. I guess in theory you could use it from a Hellhound if desired, but it's quite a costly vehicle for just handing out this one rule. I feel like this one will be useful with a bunch of infantry running around to put a 1 command point down on an important enemy unit that you're going to focus. Could be great to amp up the shooting from a Scion block that's just dropped out of reserve to deliver some big damage to them, or just something that you're going to fire a whole bunch of Rogue or Dawn shots at or similar. Finally, for 1 command point, we've got Aerial Extraction, which is a really nice one. This one's a nice simple return to reserves, either for a Valkyrie or an infantry unit with deep strike, provided they're out of engagement range with the enemy. Again, just due to how niche the Valkyrie is, with Games Workshop's seeming hatred of flyers in 10th edition, it's going to be really quite niche on that. This is really nice for Scion squads or maybe Aquilons though. It could just be good for cheap objective grabber units that could drop down if they're not dealt with, go back into reserve to continue to threaten to drop 4 secondaries when it makes sense to. Or could be nice for a big damage dealer brick with the command squad and a whole bunch of special weapons to flatten the enemy. Overall it's just really solid, and you could have some Scions in your deployment zone as well with this. Perhaps have them holed up in a ruin ready to jump on the enemy if they press on you too aggressively. Or towards the end of the game have them return to reserve for some big hitting damage to come down for some effective turn 4 or 5 reserves. Overall I feel like there's some pretty good support here. The Ignored Cover one and the Advance and Shoot one are just handy for guard in general. Both are really quite good just for coordinating big tank firepower around, never mind Scion stuff. The Close Drop, Aerial Extraction and Buffed Hotshots all seem pretty nice for the Scions. Finally though, we're moving on to the enhancements, and first up we have the Bombast class Vox Array for 25 points. This one just makes orders way more efficient. A Tempestus officer with a Master Vox in the unit can issue 3 orders rather than 1. That seems really good if you wanted to have say 2 squads dropping down next to each other. I feel like I'd be more tempted to do that as opposed to have one guy camped in the home field with this, though I guess that's also something else you could do. It's to actually allow the units to make pretty good use of that command rod as well, as you could put 2 orders on the bearer's own unit and then broadcast 1 elsewhere. Seems really nice, and that seems a pretty reasonable include on a command squad with a Scion squad dropping in. Next up, for 30 points, and we've got Priority Drop Beacon. This one again is a Tempestus officer 1 only. You can arrive from Deep Strike reserves turn 1 if you want to. I think a first turn drop is really quite scary in this one. Potentially you could be doing this turn 1 before your opponents even had a chance to move anything, and even spend your 1 command point on the first turn for a 6-inch drop if you wanted to, so your opponent's going to have to really carefully think about screening all the way from turn 1 unless they want some important things shot down in a way that they wouldn't normally have to. Could be quite a nice option for clearing out some enemy screening units as well. Have the first wave aimed to do that maybe with a bunch of hotshot volley guns or similar, and then get ready for further drops turn 2. Again, this one seems well worth it for 30 points on a similar squad. Next up, for 15 points, we've got Shroud Projector, which is a Deny Overwatch style one. It maybe doesn't seem quite as big or strategy changing compared with the other 2, though I feel like if you had 3 different Militarum Tempestus squads dropping in, this would be absolutely fine on a 3rd one. It could allow you to drop into places that are just overly threatened by Overwatch, things like next to a Land Raider Redeemer if you wanted to, or within range of Rubric Warp Flamers. I feel like for 15 points it could be really valuable in certain matchups where it matters, though it won't always be the case. Again, combined with the 6-inch deep strike, this one could get a squad in absolute safety to a whole load of threatening places on the board. Finally, for 15 points, there's Advanced Augury. This one's an infantry officer being able to redeploy 3 regiment units, including putting them into strategic reserve. I guess maybe this could be handy enough on scouting Kazakin or wanting to do some sort of absolutely maximal reserve strategy where you put lots of units down and then just put them back up into the skies once more. I guess if you completely maxed out your Scion squad and Aquilon squad allowances, you could have kind of a hilarious amount of drop troops in the sky. I feel like in reality though it's probably going to get into diminishing returns with reserves rules, and it's far better to have at least a few things on the board to actually threaten the enemy if they move up. I guess combined with things like scout moves it could be interesting enough, maybe on Kazakin perhaps, or maybe scout sentinels or something. Overall though, I feel like they've done pretty well with this one. The detachment rule seems solid enough to actually be interesting and compete with born soldiers at the moment. And overall I do think that the detachment has enough interesting stuff that you could conceivably want to run them, though I do think you would absolutely have to run a good number of scions, which I guess is what they're intending really, to encourage people to make a heavy scion list and make that rewarding enough with extra rules. I feel like the most obvious thing to start with would probably be 3 Scion command squads with some combination of special weapons and a few of the command squad style upgrades, potentially even take all 3 of the drop support enhancements which all have good merits, and then make good use of the supporting stratagems with things like the 6-inch drop, ignores cover and the hotshot stratagem, and then maybe returning things to reserve. I think I'd probably be tempted to max out the Tempestus Scion squads, maybe have a couple dropping in for more utility things where you could have them bounce on and off the board for 1 command point, unless you want to leave that to Gaunt's Ghost or a Calidus maybe. I guess being able to 6-inch drop battle line units into the enemy's backfield at the end of the game could be really quite big for secret missions. Otherwise the ignores cover debuff and the advance and shoot stratagem is just generally helpful for the guard. I don't think that the trade-offs that you make from a combined regiment are so great that you wouldn't want to run some other stuff along with some big heavy tanks to deal a bit of mass damage. For trade-offs, the biggest one I think is lethal hits on tanks. The infantry still get a fair bit of big damage stuff, though it does cool off a fair bit after the initial drop. It's a shame not to be able to use reinforcements to recycle one of the slain Tempestus Scion squads, and otherwise for the Scion playstyle in general, both Scions and Aquilons both got at least fairly big points hikes. I still think that the Scions will be usable, but they're not quite as devastating for their points costs as they were previously. There's a bit of uncertainty as we don't know how much units will change in the codex. I feel like there's maybe a little bit less support for the Scion vehicles like the Valkyrie and the Taurox Prime, and less support for Kazakin than I might have liked. I feel like it wouldn't have been the worst idea for this one to be the Scion plus Kazakin style detachment, or at least to allow them to maybe use the core detachment rule. Broadly though, I think it does look good. Have a whole bunch of Scions as drop threats and doing secondaries and things, and then have some infantry in the deployment zone plus some big scary gun tanks. Perhaps some units moving up in Taurox Primes for +1 to wound and reroll wound rolls. Overall seems fun enough to try out, though I do feel like you need quite a lot of Scions to make it work. In any case though, let me know your thoughts. What would you make of it, and would you be tempted to put an army on the table? And how do you think it competes against combined regiment in the interim until we get the codex? In any case, I'll leave that one there for this one. I'll just give a shout out once more to Deploymats for sponsoring the video. If you want to pick up a rather snazzy double-sided battle mat design shipped from down under, then feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. I was sent one of these to check it out myself, and I must admit I really quite like the quality of it. I think it's really quite a big selling point to have the deployment zones marked out until Games Workshop gets around to changing them again, I suppose. There'll be links down in the video description. In any case though, I'll be back to talk some Orc tactical stuff in the not too distant future. Looking forward to that. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see that, or just check that for more videos. I do usually tend to have multiple ones coming out just about every day. In the video description as well, there's the channel Patreon and the channel's affiliate discount links if you're looking to pick up some Warhammer miniatures. Both of those are direct ways to support if you'd like to. Thanks to all of those using them. But in any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.